This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're traveling through time with two economic historians to examine critical periods of United States history, the Civil War and the Great Depression. In the process, we're going to blow up some myths that many people believe about these important times in our history. My first guest is Dr. Jeffery Hummel. Dr. Hummel is a professor of economics at San Jose State University, but he actually earned his Ph.D. in history here in Texas, but from a school whose name I'm not going to mention on this show. He's also author of the book, Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, A History of the Civil War, which is our topic for discussion here today. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So let's start. This is a very unique history of the Civil War that you write in this book, and in it you disagree with a lot of things that people read in their high school history books, which is going to be an ongoing theme here today, people. One of them is the second half of the show. We're going to talk about the Great Depression and FDR, and a lot of people in Texas who are kind of free market orientated seem to think, it was the Great Depression and the New Deal. That's when government started getting big and out of control on us, but you have a different take on that.
Yes, I do. The Great Depression, it's a common myth among both conservatives and liberal that the Great Depression sort of represents the turning point where government all of a sudden started getting bigger, but one of the arguments in my book is that really the turning point is the Civil War. That prior to the Civil War, from the American Revolution on forward, the general tendency was for government to get less powerful, less intrusive, the long run tendency. And that during the Civil War, you see this huge surge in government power, temporary, and then after the Civil War, the trend reverses, so that the long run trend is for government to get more expansive, more intrusive, more involved in the economy and people's lives.
So can you give me an idea? I mean, a lot of people think of Lincoln as a hero, and you're suggesting it was during his tenure that the era of big government started to come in. Can you give us an idea of what are some of the ways that government transformed while he was in power and some that were the legacy afterwards?
Well, while he was in power, of course, wars are very expensive. Those are the most expensive things that governments do. So governments always increase in power during war. And some of the examples are, first of all, you have conscription in order to raise the armies to fight the war. You also have increased taxation. The first income tax in U.S. history at the national level is passed during the Civil War. You have the issue of paper money to finance the war and an inflation which in the North essentially doubled prices. And you also had a lot of intervention in the economy to mobilize the economy for the war effort. And one of the sectors where the intervention was most severe was in the banking sector, where essentially you got a lot of the features of the banking system we have today involving regulation, the creation of the national banking system created for the first time.
So even before the Federal Reserve,
before the Federal Reserve, yeah, the government. In fact, the U.S. has never had a fully deregulated financial system ever, but prior to the Civil War, it was deregulated at the national level, not at the state level, and that changed as a result of the Civil War. And so that's one of the big changes in the trend.
One of my fears now in the post 9/11 world too is not just our economic freedoms, but civil freedoms and the relationship of government to society. Now, how did that change during the Civil War?
Well, during the Civil War, Lincoln, and this is pretty well known. This is not something unique to my book on the Civil War. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and arrested a lot of.
Suspend habeas corpus. What does that mean?
Habeas corpus is the legal rule that allows you to be charged and tried promptly if you are arrested. And essentially what happened is that Lincoln arrested large numbers of opponents of the war, both in the northern states and in the southern states. Newspapers were suppressed for temporary periods. Parts of the country were put under military rule. So you had a general diminution of civil liberties during the war. Now, one interesting thing that happened during the war and continued afterwards that many people aren't aware of is that the first statute regulating obscene mail going through the post office was passed during the Civil War due to complaints that the troops were ordering this material. And if you know anything about the history of the late 19th century, this was the precursor to the Comstock Acts, where people were thrown in jail for writing about birth control and for all sorts of other salacious materials.
Now, there's some people out there who will agree with the things you said about the growth of big government in the North, but then they'll say, well, you know, on the South, they were upholding the principle of secession and they left the Union, and then they don't kind of really say much about how that government worked.
Yeah, the two governments were almost mirror images of each other in terms of financing, in terms of raising the armies. They both practiced conscription. In terms of financing, they both had heavy taxation. They both had paper money. In the case of the Confederacy, it resulted in a hyperinflation. They both suppressed civil liberties. It was slightly more decentralized in the Confederacy than in the North, but it was equally pervasive. And then in terms of regulating the economy, now there is a difference, but with respect to that difference, the Confederacy is actually more interventionist than the Union, because the Union had this, you had the beginning of industrialization in the North, so they had some native industry to draw upon to get materials to fight the war, whereas the Confederacy had very little native industry, and so they actually had a system that I characterize as Confederate war socialism, where they had the government create industries to provide the ammunition and the clothing for the troops and that sort of thing. So economically, the Confederacy was actually more centralized.
So Civil War, whichever side you were on, it was a growth of big government.
Growth of big government.
So,
and then you have retrenchment afterwards. But first of all, the size of government never went back in the North to the pre-war level, and a lot of precedents are set with respect to income taxes, which are repealed but then reinstated. The Civil War is responsible for prior to the Civil War, and this is another thing that many people don't realize, tariffs had reached their lowest point in American history. And during the Civil War, you had protectionist tariffs imposed so that the reign of protectionism actually dominated the country's trade policy mercilessly until the Great Depression.
So I agree with all these things you're saying. I imagine there's someone watching right now who says, oh, maybe I didn't know these things, that's horrible. But, well, the result was we ended slavery. And if we had to get big government in the North, then the legacy of this because of it, well, so be it, it was still good. What do you think
I agree
of that?
totally that ending slavery was the great accomplishment of the Civil War, and its importance cannot be overestimated. But the question then arises, was the Civil War necessary to end slavery? And one of the arguments of my book is that there is, if the Northerners had been interested in ending slavery rather than preserving the Union, there's a set of policies they could have adopted that would have brought down slavery within an independent Confederacy, possibly within 4 years, which is the length of the Civil War, and certainly by the turn of the century.
There was actually abolitionists back at this time who thought things like that, where they'd say no union with slaveholders.
Right, yeah. Right? Many of your most radical abolitionists that emerged on the scene in the 1830s were advocates of disunion. William Lloyd Garrison, on the masthead of his Liberator, said no union with slaveholders, and initially when the South seceded, he was just concerned that they were bluffing. And historians are aware of this, but they don't appreciate the economic significance of this strategy. They just think it's sort of like a moral position that would have been ineffectual. But in fact,
we've got about 3 minutes left. Then describe the economics that would do the unraveling
okay, well,
of slavery.
the critical question was the Achilles heel of all slave systems has always been fugitive slaves. And the idea that the abolitionists advocated at the beginning of the when they first came on the scene, was to turn the North into a haven for runaway slaves. Because if a slave ran away to the North, right, they were still subject to the fugitive slave law, which is why the Underground Railroad terminated in Canada rather than in Pennsylvania. And so one of the policies, and the most important policy, that the North could have adopted, which would have affected even an independent Confederacy, is allowing slaves to run away. And that would have significantly affected the value of slaves. If we look historically at the impact of runaways, if a significant number of slaves can run away, it affects the entire slave system.
So presumably it's easier for some to run away than others. Did you see evidence of this when you're looking at
yes. See, part of the reason why historians haven't recognized the economic significance of the runaways is that they've been looking at the runaways as a percent of the total population, about 1,000 per year. But in fact, not all slaves are equally likely to run away. First of all, infants don't run away, pregnant women don't run away. So most of the slaves who ran away were, first of all, prime-age males, the most valuable slaves, and they ran away from the border slave states. And if you look at those numbers, those are significant numbers. And so what was happening is that slavery was declining in the border states. If the border states eventually became free states, then that would move the border south, and slavery would be subject to a domino effect. And this actually partially inspired Southerners to secede. If you look at the South Carolina Ordinance of Secession, the grievance they give the greatest play to is not Lincoln's election, but Northern failure to faithfully and fully observe the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution.
Well, Jeff, thanks for joining us today and bringing in these two provocative and probably original topics to a lot of people.
Well, you're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Up next, have you ever heard that FDR helped to save our economy from the Great Depression? How about that World War II is what ended the Depression? My next guest says that both of these statements are myths and that the New Deal and World War II made us poorer. We'll be right back.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Robert Higgs. Dr. Higgs is an economic historian and a senior fellow in political economy at the Independent Institute. He's the author of 8 books, including Depression, War, and Cold War. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ben.
So let's talk about the Great Depression and World War II today, as we're on a theme of an episode on history here today. So let's start with times were good in the 1920s. How did we ever get into a Great Depression to start with?
Well, I think we got into one for two kinds of reasons, and each kind has a lot of elements in it. The first problem was that some of the government policies undertaken before 1929 predisposed the economy to a contraction at some point, virtually made it inevitable. And we can, and if we're being thorough, we should trace some of these all the way back to World War I and the dislocations that were created in the economy, not only in this country, but in Europe and other places.
So are these things like monetary flows?
These are things like the ruination of the gold standard that had functioned quite well before 1914, the inflation of currencies and all the belligerent powers enormously driving up price levels, and also the change in the structure of economic activity, because when the governments went to war, of course, they tended to create huge demands for certain kinds of materials and products that were related to war, and reduce demands for more civilian-oriented goods and services. But of course, that's not a structure of economic production that's viable in the long run. So there had to be adjustments after the war, and there needed to be both monetary adjustments and structural adjustments in all the economies, including the United States. Unfortunately, the main powers never fully reverted to the kind of gold standard regime that had existed before 1914. they created something we call the gold exchange standard, which was a fake gold standard in which the only country really that had gold reserves to back up its currency was the United States. Not even Great Britain any longer could do that. And so
the gold had flowed across the Atlantic to us, right?
Yes.
But wasn't that a good thing?
It was not a good thing, actually, because it created these dislocations among trading partners. And it put the United States in a position where U.S. policymakers felt they had to help the Europeans adjust in some way. And this gold exchange standard was part of a series of negotiated agreements in which people tried to put together the old gold standard, and one country after another went back on what they called the gold standard. But since they didn't have the gold reserves to have a true gold standard, what they did instead was basically substitute U.S. securities and credit from the Federal Reserve System of the United States.
So this made the United States create too much money in the boom of the 20s?
It did that. At some points, the Federal Reserve System, in an attempt to help the British get back on the gold standard, tried to keep interest rates in the United States lower than they otherwise would have been, so that people wouldn't be sending their investments away from Britain over to the United States, making Britain's return to gold more difficult. But not only did that serve to help Britain go back to the gold standard, phony as it was, but it had other effects. By holding down interest rates here, the Fed was encouraging certain kinds of investments, particularly long-term investments in construction, residential and commercial construction especially, and that was distorting the structure of the capital stock in the United States in a way that could not remain that way forever.
Whoa, this sounds kind of familiar, the Fed holding down interest rates and asset prices. So sticking with the 1920s and 30s, so the stock market then has a big bubble in it. It eventually crashes. If I was reading, instead of Depression War and Cold War, my high school history book, it probably told me something like, and the stock market crashed and laissez-faire Hoover, he did nothing and capitalism was failing. Is that roughly right?
No, it's totally wrong. What actually happened was the second class of problems, the first being the creation of these structural imbalances in the economy during the 20s by bad monetary policy. The second set of problems all were examples of how the government reacted to the onset of the contraction in the middle of 1929 by taking a series of policy actions that all made the situation worse. At the time, many people believed that what the government was doing would prevent the downturn from becoming severe, but in fact, it was actually making it become severe quicker than it would have otherwise.
And this was all before FDR came along?
Long before.
So what was Hoover and his people doing?
Hoover immediately after the stock market crash called together a number of top industrialists and labor leaders and some other people who were important actors in the economy. And he prevailed on them not to cut wages, because Hoover had developed his own thinking about depressions.
It's always dangerous when a president does that.
Unfortunately for the American people, Hoover was not the usual dopey president. He was actually a highly intelligent man who had a very successful career in international business, but he was not a good economist. And the ideas he had developed about how to deal with depressions were wrong-headed. And so by getting people to agree with him to not cut wages, what he did was create a quicker increase in unemployment than would have occurred if wages had been cut and employers had been better able to retain employees. Mm-hmm. But he didn't do that. He did the wrong thing, and by the time people began to wriggle out from under their promise to Hoover not to cut wages, a year and a half or more had gone by, and unemployment had become quite severe. And of course, every time people became unemployed, that caused their spending to decline and created problems for people elsewhere in the economy.
Okay, so Hoover laissez-faire is a myth. He starts us down this path in the Great Depression. If I kept reading that same high school history book, next it would be the whole economy was collapsing and FDR got elected and he started doing things that stopped it all from getting worse. True or false?
Well, that's also a myth. It is true, and it's an unfortunate kind of spurious correlation that from the time Roosevelt took office in the spring of 1933, the economy did tend to improve somewhat, but it did not improve very rapidly. Even most economists now think of the Great Depression as V-shaped, rapid contraction followed by rapid recovery. But in fact, it fell rapidly and it fell into a ditch. The years 1932, 33, and 34 were almost carbon copies of one another.
So instead of a V, this feels more like a grave hole.
It was definitely a U-shaped event rather than a V-shaped one. But what did happen was some of the measures the New Deal took in 1933 had a short-run stimulating effect that was misleading and still mislead economists. When, for example, they created the National Industrial Recovery System, what they did was allow every industry in the country virtually to cartelize, to create agreements to suppress competition, but they also required that people recognize labor unions and pay at least a certain minimum wage to their employees. When they did that, many industries, managers realized that as soon as those requirements took effect, labor costs would rise. And so to get a head start, they increased their rates of production in late 1933 for about 6 months' time, and it created the impression the economy had suddenly begun to recover quickly. But that recovery leveled out after less than a year and then stayed almost level for the next year and a half until the Supreme Court invalidated the National Industrial Recovery Act.
And then did we start recovering a little?
Then there was more recovery for a couple of years. And again, at the time and today, for many economists, that signified the success of New Deal measures. But again, it was spurious, was misleading, because while some of the New Deal measures had short-term stimulating effects, they also were creating the seeds of destruction. And what happened was in 1937, those chickens came home to roost, as it were, and particularly when Roosevelt's going on the warpath against investors and businessmen in 1935 and 36, it scared a lot of them into thinking that he was going to become a dictator like Hitler or Mussolini in Europe. So what happened was that investment collapse is one of the most severe investment collapses in American history, 1937-38. Prices fell drastically again. GDP fell. Unemployment shot up. And we were back in the Depression almost as bad as we had been in 1933.
So as their environment becomes uncertain, businesses ran to the sideline. Again, sounds eerily familiar. We've got like a minute left. Let me finish with the last one from my well-worn-out high school history book now. So all of that happened, but then those stimuluses just weren't enough. World War II came along, and we just mobilized the economy. Everybody was working, prosperity. Last minute left. What do you say to this?
It's a complete myth. There was no wartime prosperity. Unemployment disappeared entirely because of the buildup of the armed forces and, in turn, munitions workers. Private incomes fell. Private investment fell during the war. It was simply a matter of a massive substitution of guns for butter, and because everybody was working or fighting, people had the false impression that this was genuine prosperity. But genuine prosperity didn't return until the war ended and reconversion took place back to a civilian basis.
Because the economy is not about producing stuff and blowing it up. It's about producing stuff that makes our lives better.
Stuff that people actually value for their own consumption or for their own private investment.
Well, Bob, thanks for joining and explaining and exploding some of these myths for us.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, we're on PBS, not the Discovery Station, but we still did a bit of our own myth busting today with our own economic historians. So as I think about these myths, that Hoover was laissez-faire and let us go into the Great Depression. No. That FDR and his New Deal helped to make the Great Depression less severe. Sorry again. That World War II was the stimulus that finally got us out of the Great Depression. No again. That it was FDR and the New Deal that started the era of big government in the United States. Sorry, that goes back to the Civil War. And maybe most provocatively, that the Civil War was necessary to end slavery. No, my economic historian says it would have happened anyway for economic reasons pretty shortly thereafter. That's a lot of work for one day. We'll see you next time.